He took a fake bride for his father's funeral, but she became his only real home. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The heavy toll of church bells echoed through the crisp autumn air. Mourners in dark coats moved slowly up the marble steps, their voices hushed, their faces pale. At the center of it all stood Adrian Hale, the only son of the late business titan Richard Hale. His father had built an empire of steel and shipping that spanned 3 continents, but Adrian stood like stone, his grief hidden behind a mask of control. Everyone in the crowd expected a certain image. A grieving son, yes, but also the future head of the Hale dynasty. And a dynasty demanded appearances. For a man of Adrian's position, to stand alone at the funeral of such a powerful patriarch would raise whispers. Worse, it would invite doubt in boardrooms where power was measured not just by numbers, but by perception. But Adrian had a problem. He was single. He had refused countless society matches, never allowing himself to be tied down. And now, with the reading of the will looming after the funeral, he realized his father had left one last cruel twist. The inheritance of the Hale fortune required Adrian to present a wife by his side, a partner to symbolize the stability of family and legacy. Without her, he would lose everything to his scheming uncle. That was when fate pushed him into a stranger's path. She was standing outside the funeral home, a slim young woman holding a worn leather notebook against her chest. Her name was Claire. She had been hired by the funeral service to write and deliver personalized eulogies for grieving families. Her dark hair was tied back, her coat was second-hand, and the scuff marks on her shoes betrayed a life of hardship. Yet her voice carried a quiet strength as she practiced lines under her breath, unaware that Adrian was watching her. He did not see just a girl rehearsing words. He saw an opportunity. Adrian approached her with the same composure he used in billion-dollar negotiations. His tone was low, steady, commanding. "You, come with me." Claire blinked, startled. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "You will," he replied coldly. He pulled a folded document from his pocket. "A contract. Stand beside me today as my wife. You will play the role until the will is read. Do this, and you will be paid more than you could earn in 10 years. Refuse, and you will regret it." Abuser. Her heart pounded in her chest. It sounded insane. Marry a stranger? Pretend to be his wife? At a funeral? But then she thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed, her medical bills growing like a mountain she could never climb. She thought of the eviction notice waiting at her apartment door. Survival sometimes forced impossible choices. Claire lifted her chin. "How long?" 3 days, Adrian answered. "Until the lawyers finish their business. To all. And then? Then you disappear from my life." His voice was final, but his eyes, cold gray under the funeral sky, flickered with something unreadable. She hesitated only a moment longer, then pressed the pen to the page and signed her name. By the time the organ swelled inside the church and the casket was carried down the aisle, Adrian Hale walked in with a bride at his side. Guests gasped, whispers flew like arrows, but Adrian did not flinch. He tightened his grip on Claire's arm, holding her steady, while the storm of suspicion brewed around them. No one in that room knew that she was nothing more than a contract. No one, not even Adrian himself, could imagine that she would soon become the only place he could truly call home. The church bells had fallen silent, and the last guests left whispers behind them as they drifted out into the evening air. Inside the dim hall, Adrian and Claire remained side by side, though the contract between them weighed heavier than the black veil covering her face. She had thought the moment would feel like acting, a play staged for strangers. Instead, every stare from the mourners seared into her skin, as though they could see straight through her. When they stepped into the waiting limousine, Adrian finally spoke. His voice was controlled, clipped, as though the exchange of vows had never happened. "From this moment forward, you will remember your role. You are Mrs. Claire Hale. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not contradict me. Your only duty is to stand at my side until this business is finished." Claire's hands tightened in her lap. The leather seat beneath her felt too smooth, too clean, nothing like the cracked vinyl chairs of the buses she usually took across the city. She drew a breath. "And after this business is finished, I leave?" Adrian turned his gaze from the window. His gray eyes were sharp as cut steel. "You walk away, paid in full. There will be no connection between us after that. Do you understand?" She nodded, though her stomach twisted. The promise of money strong enough to save her mother's life had forced her hand. But sitting there, beside a man who looked like a statue carved of ice, she wondered what price her soul might pay. The car slowed as it entered the gates of the Hale estate. The mansion rose ahead, its stone walls towering like a fortress. Lights glowed in dozens of windows, where relatives and business associates already waited. For generations, this house had been the stage for Hale power, and tonight it would become her cage. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume and judgment. Women in pearls and men in tailored suits turned their heads as Adrian entered with a bride none of them had met before. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. "Who is she? Where did she come from? She does not look like old money." Adrian ignored them all. His hand pressed firmly against the small of Claire's back, guiding her forward with the certainty of command. They stopped before a polished mahogany door. He leaned close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "This is where you will stay. Tomorrow there will be lawyers, relatives, and vultures. Keep your answers simple. Smile when necessary. Speak of loyalty, respect, and family. Nothing more, nothing less." Claire stepped into the room and looked around. It was not just a guest room. It was prepared like a bridal chamber, with fresh roses in crystal vases, and a gown laid across the bed. She swallowed hard. This was more than an arrangement. This was theater, staged for an audience determined to catch her every mistake. Alone for the first time since signing her name, she sank onto the edge of the bed. She touched the thin band of the wedding ring on her finger. It glittered under the chandelier, beautiful yet false, like everything in this house. She whispered to herself, 3 days. Just 3 days. But in the halls beyond, where portraits of stern ancestors watched with painted eyes, plans were already moving against her. Adrian's uncle, a man with a smile too polished and a gaze too cold, poured himself a glass of brandy and said to a cousin, "She is nothing but a prop. We will tear her apart before the will is read." Claire did not yet know the danger waiting for her. She believed the greatest challenge would be pretending to be Adrian's wife. She did not realize the charade was only the beginning, and that the mansion she had entered was not a sanctuary, but a battlefield. And in the middle of it stood Adrian, a man who told himself he did not need a real wife, a real home, or real love. Yet with every passing hour, the illusion he built would begin to crack. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself was in mourning. Claire woke in the massive room that did not feel like hers. The silk sheets were smooth against her skin, but the weight of expectation pressed down harder than any blanket. She dressed quickly in the gown left for her, a simple black dress with pearls at the collar, elegant but far too fine for someone who had spent her life stretching every dollar. When she stepped out into the hallway, Adrian was already waiting. His suit was flawless, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he instructed, his tone clipped. "Today is the real test. The family will push, the lawyers will pry. You cannot falter." She nodded, though her hands trembled. "I will do what I must." Martam. Together they descended the grand staircase. In the parlor below, a crowd of relatives lingered like vultures circling a carcass. Adrian's uncle sat in a leather chair, his smile sharp as a blade. He rose slowly, extending a hand to Claire. "So this is the mysterious wife," the uncle drawled, his eyes scanning her with thinly veiled contempt. "You arrived quickly. Too quickly, perhaps." Claire forced herself to take his hand. "Grief moves faster than we expect," she replied softly. Her words were simple, but her steady tone surprised even herself. The uncle's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "We shall see if you are truly a Hale." The room filled with questions disguised as conversation. Where had she grown up? Who were her parents? How had she met Adrian? Each inquiry was delivered with syrupy politeness, but the barbs beneath were sharp. Claire answered carefully, staying within the story Adrian had whispered to her the night before. She was polite, respectful, and never too detailed. But then came the first blow. A cousin, dressed in jewels that glittered under the chandelier, leaned close with a sneer. "That dress is from last season. Did you not think to wear something new?" Surely a Hale bride could do better. Heat rushed to Claire's cheeks, but before she could stammer, Adrian's voice cut through the air. "She wears what she chooses. And if you have time to criticize fabric, perhaps you should spend more time managing your own investments." The cousin's face blanched. The room fell silent. For the first time, Claire realized Adrian was not just cold. He was protective in his own severe way. Later, during the luncheon that followed, Claire found herself seated beside the household staff. She noticed the weary eyes of the maid pouring water, the limp in the butler's step as he carried heavy trays. Without thinking, she rose to help steady the pitcher before it slipped. The maid gasped softly, unaccustomed to kindness from guests, much less from the supposed lady of the house. Whispers followed again, this time with a different edge. "Did you see? She helped the maid. She actually touched the dishes." Adrian watched from across the table. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He had expected her to be fragile, overwhelmed, perhaps broken under pressure. Instead, she was steady, unshaken, showing a dignity the wealthy around her lacked. That night, as Claire returned to her room, she paused before the portrait of Richard Hale, Adrian's father. The stern face seemed to watch her, to measure her worth. She whispered under her breath, "I do not belong here, but I will not bow to them." What she did not realize was that Adrian stood just behind her, unseen in the shadows. He heard her words, and for the first time since the funeral began, a trace of warmth touched the stone of his heart. But outside the grand walls of the estate, plans were still being made. Adrian's uncle poured another drink and muttered to his allies, "She plays the part well. But tomorrow, we will expose her." Claire did not yet know how brutal the next test would be. She only knew that she had survived this day. And in the cold storm of suspicion, a small spark of strength had begun to glow within her. The next morning began with a sky the color of slate, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The Hale mansion stirred early, servants moving briskly to prepare for another day of solemn gatherings and relentless scrutiny. Claire stood at the vanity, fastening the simple earrings that had been provided for her. She caught her own reflection and almost laughed. She looked like a woman she had never met, wrapped in elegance that did not belong to her. Adrian appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room without a word. "Today we attend the board meeting," he said. "Every director will be there. They will measure me by the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you look at me. Fail, and they will use it to destroy us both." Claire drew a breath. "I am not your shield," she answered quietly, "but I will not let them break me either." "Haimoti." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Good, then let us go." The drive to the Hale corporate tower was silent. Claire gazed out the window at the skyline, steel and glass rising like a forest of ambition. She had never imagined she would set foot in such a place. When the car pulled to a stop, cameras flashed instantly. Reporters shouted questions, hungry for scandal. Adrian took her hand, a motion rehearsed but startling in its firmness, and guided her through the storm of voices. Inside the marble lobby, every step echoed. They entered the boardroom where polished oak stretched the length of the chamber. Men in expensive suits sat with watchful eyes. Women in diamonds lifted brows in silent judgment. Adrian's uncle presided at the head of the table, his smile dripping false courtesy. "Welcome, nephew," he said, "and welcome to your wife." We were eager to finally meet her. Claire kept her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. Adrian pulled out a chair for her, a gesture so deliberate it silenced whispers. She sat, folding her hands neatly, and waited. The meeting turned quickly to business. Reports, numbers, projections, all spoken in a language Claire barely understood. Yet she listened closely, noting the way Adrian's voice carried authority, the way the uncle constantly interrupted, seeding doubt. At one point, the uncle leaned forward with a sly smile. "Mrs. Hale," he said, addressing Claire directly, "since you are new to this family, perhaps you can tell us what you think of our future strategies. Do you support your husband's vision?" It was a trap. Every eye fixed on her, waiting for her to stumble. Claire felt her pulse race, but she met the gaze without flinching. "I believe a legacy is not only numbers on paper," she said softly, her voice steady. "It is the people who carry it forward. And a family that stands together cannot be broken by doubt." Silence filled the boardroom. Then, to everyone's shock, one of the elder directors gave a slow nod. "Well said." Adrian's uncle's smile thinned, but he recovered quickly. "Words are easy. Time will tell if she belongs." The meeting adjourned hours later. Outside the tower, the storm finally broke, rain falling in cold sheets across the city. Adrian led her back to the car. For the first time since they had met, he spoke without ice in his tone. "You handled yourself well." Claire looked at him, searching his face. "You expected me to fail?" "I expected you to be afraid," he admitted. "But you were not." As the car pulled away, Claire rested her head against the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. She had entered this world as nothing but a hired stand-in, but every challenge pressed her deeper into a role that no longer felt like an act. What neither of them yet realized was that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm waiting within the mansion walls. Secrets were stirring, and the thin line between truth and performance was beginning to blur. That evening the mansion glowed with too much light for a house still draped in mourning. Chandeliers blazed as relatives and shareholders gathered for yet another dinner. The long table stretched like a battlefield, polished silver lined up as though weapons in a silent war. Claire sat beside Adrian, her posture poised, her heart steady, even as whispers continued to buzz around her like angry bees. She had survived the boardroom, but tonight the challenge was more personal. Adrian's uncle had arranged the dinner as a test. The guest list included not only family, but influential allies who thrived on gossip. Every glance, every slip of the tongue could be twisted into a weapon. The meal began in strained silence until one of the cousins lifted her glass. "To Adrian and his wife," she said, letting the pause drip with mockery. "May their union prove stronger than it appears." Laughter rippled along the table. Claire's hand tightened around her fork, but Adrian did not react. He cut into his meal with precision, as though their barbs were beneath his notice. Claire forced herself to follow his example, but inside her chest a quiet fire burned. Halfway through the evening, the uncle rose with a theatrical sigh. "Perhaps the young Mrs. Hale would honor us with a toast," he said. His voice was smooth, but his eyes were sharp. "After all, she has stepped into this family so suddenly. We are eager to hear her heart." Every gaze swung to Claire. She rose slowly, the clink of her glass against the silver stem echoing through the hall. For a moment she saw her reflection in the polished surface of the wine, and she thought of her mother lying in the hospital, thought of her childhood in small rented apartments where hope was a luxury. She lifted her chin. "I do not come from wealth," she began, her voice clear. "I do not come from power, but I understand love, respect, and loyalty. A family is not measured by the grandeur of its house, but by the way it protects one another. If I stand here tonight, it is not because I am flawless, but because I believe even the strongest legacy means nothing without truth." The room hushed. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the elder women, a matriarch with silver hair and piercing eyes, placed her glass down firmly. "She speaks with more wisdom than most of us," the woman said. Applause broke in small, reluctant waves. Adrian's uncle smiled tightly, his plan to humiliate her backfiring before his own guests. Adrian leaned closer, his voice low, so only she could hear. "You are full of surprises." Later that night, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Adrian found Claire standing on the balcony. The night air was cold, carrying the faint smell of rain-soaked earth. She did not hear him approach until he spoke. "You were not supposed to care," he said. Claire turned, her eyes steady. "I did not speak for them. I spoke for myself." Stow. For the first time, his expression softened, as though the ice in his chest cracked slightly. "You stood there like you belonged." She gave a small smile. "Maybe I do not belong in your world, but I will not let them decide my worth." Adrian studied her, silent for a long moment. Then he said something that startled even him. "My father would have respected that." Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. She had thought of Richard Hale only as a portrait on the wall, but now she realized his shadow hung over Adrian like a chain. As she turned back to the dark horizon, a quiet certainty settled in her heart. What had begun as a contract was no longer just survival. They were becoming partners, bound not by paper but by something far more dangerous: trust. And in the world of the Hales, trust was the rarest currency of all. The following day brought a chill that seemed to settle into the bones of the mansion. A heavy fog hung over the grounds, muffling sound, as though the world itself braced for confrontation. Claire dressed in silence, aware that something was shifting. She had felt it in Adrian's gaze the night before, the way he had let a sliver of warmth escape. But warmth in this house was dangerous. By mid-morning, the storm struck. Newspapers arrived at the gates, their front pages stamped with headlines that made her blood run cold. Gold digger bride snatches Hale fortune. Photographs of her entering the church, standing beside Adrian, even carrying a tray at the dinner, filled the columns with poisoned speculation. Words like fraud and scandal dripped from every page. Adrian's uncle wasted no time. He stormed into the drawing room where Adrian and Claire stood together. He tossed the papers across the table. There it is, in black and white. The world already sees her for what she is: a common girl chasing wealth, a stain on our family name. Claire's hands shook as she picked up one of the papers. The image of her face, frozen mid-step, looked like a stranger's. The text accused her of deception, of tricking Adrian into marriage for money. Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. "These are lies," the uncle sneered. "Lies are easier to believe than inconvenient truths. The board will demand answers. And when they learn the marriage is nothing but a charade, Adrian will lose everything." Adrian's eyes darkened. Enough. His voice was low, controlled, but his fury simmered just beneath the surface. He turned to Claire, but she saw something in his gaze that cut deeper than any insult: doubt. For a flicker of a moment, he questioned her. Claire's heart twisted. She wanted to scream that she had never wanted his fortune, that she had signed the contract only to save her mother's life. But the words caught in her throat. If she confessed the truth, would he believe her, or would he see it as further proof that she was desperate and weak? The room fell into silence. Adrian's uncle smiled, victorious. "You see, nephew? Even you are unsure. That hesitation is all the proof we need." Adrian dismissed the man with a sharp gesture, but the poison lingered. When they were alone, Claire finally spoke. "You think I came here to trap you, to steal what is yours?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "I do not know what to think." The words struck harder than any slap. She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. "You asked me to stand beside you. You commanded me to play the role. And I did. But I will not beg you to see me as more than a contract." Before he could reply, she left the room, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. She locked herself in the chamber that had been dressed like a bridal suite, and for the first time since she had entered the Hale mansion, she felt utterly alone. Adrian stood frozen in the drawing room. He remembered his father's final words, a line in the will that haunted him. "Only when you can value someone who has nothing to offer you will you be worthy of this empire." The irony cut him deep. He had thought Claire was nothing but a shield, a pawn, yet when the world turned its knives against him, she had been the only one to face the storm without flinching. That night, unable to sleep, Adrian found himself standing before his father's study. Inside, documents were scattered across the desk, left untouched since the funeral. He pored through them, and there it was, a hidden clause in the will. If his marriage was proven false, the inheritance would transfer immediately to his uncle. But the clause contained something more chilling. His father had known. Known that Adrian would resist marriage, known that he would try to bend the rules, known that only a woman outside their world could force him to confront his pride. The truth struck like lightning. His father had not written a will. He had written a test, and Adrian had nearly failed it by doubting the one person who had stood beside him when everyone else sought his downfall. As the mansion slept, Adrian clenched the edge of the desk, torn between pride and realization. Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the estate in silence. But inside Adrian's chest, the storm was only beginning. The next morning arrived with sunlight breaking through the fog, but the Hale mansion remained steeped in tension. Claire had barely slept. She sat by the window, her eyes hollow, her heart heavy with the weight of Adrian's doubt. When the maid brought her breakfast, she pushed the tray aside, untouched. She could not stay here, not when the man she had stood beside no longer trusted her. By mid-morning, she made her choice. She packed the few belongings she had brought, folding her worn coat with careful hands. The wedding ring, gleaming on her finger, felt like a chain rather than a symbol. She slipped it off and placed it neatly on the desk, the sound of metal against wood louder than thunder in her ears. Adrian entered just as she was fastening her bag. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. "You are leaving?" Claire turned, her voice steady, though her chest ached. "You asked me to play a part. I did. But I will not live where trust does not exist. You believe the lies because they are easier than believing in me." He stepped closer, desperation flickering in his gaze. "You do not understand. My father's will. It is more complicated than I told you. If you walk away, I lose everything. Too." Her lips curved into a bitter smile. "Then perhaps you should let it go. Perhaps everything is not worth keeping if it demands that you crush everyone around you." The words struck him, raw and true. But before he could answer, she lifted her bag and walked past him. Her footsteps echoed down the grand staircase, through the marble hall, and out the heavy doors. The silence she left behind was unbearable. Adrian stood motionless in the doorway of her chamber, staring at the abandoned ring. His father's warning echoed louder than ever. "Only when you can value someone who has nothing to offer you will you be worthy." In that moment, Adrian realized the truth. It was not the company or the fortune at stake, it was her. She had become the only thing real in his carefully constructed world, and he had let his pride drive her away. Downstairs, in another wing of the house, his uncle watched from the window as Claire disappeared down the drive. A cruel smile curved his lips. "At last," he murmured. "Now the empire will fall into my hands." Adrian did not yet know how close the danger had come. He only knew that if he wanted to protect his father's legacy, and more than that, if he wanted to win back the woman who had become his only home, he would have to fight not as a Hale heir, but as a man who finally understood what love demanded. The day of the will's final reading arrived with storm clouds rolling over the city. The Hale mansion was filled with relatives, lawyers, and members of the board, all waiting for the decisive moment. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowded hall. Claire's absence had already become fuel for gossip. Many said she had fled after her lies were exposed. Adrian stood at the head of the room, his face carved from stone, but inside his chest his heart pounded with urgency. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. "According to the late Richard Hale's instructions, the estate and majority shares will be transferred to Adrian Hale, provided his marriage is genuine and his wife stands beside him as proof." A murmur ran through the crowd. Adrian's uncle leaned forward, his voice dripping with triumph. "Then it is settled. She is gone. The marriage is false. The fortune falls to me." Adrian's jaw tightened. He could remain silent, surrender to the clause, and watch the empire collapse into his uncle's hands. Or he could do what his father's final words demanded, prove he valued someone not for her wealth or her status, but for who she truly was. The heavy doors of the hall swung open. Every head turned as Claire stepped inside. Her coat damp from rain, her eyes fierce with determination. Gasps rose around the room. She walked straight to Adrian's side, unshaken by the glares that followed her. Adrian reached for her hand, not as part of a performance, but as the choice of a man who no longer cared for appearances. He faced the room. "She is my wife, not a contract, not a fade. She is the only person who has stood beside me without asking for anything in return. And if my father's empire depends on proving that, then let this moment be proof enough." His uncle shot to his feet. "She is a fraud. She came from nothing." Claire's voice cut through the storm. "Yes, I came from nothing. But that does not make me worthless. Money can build empires, but it cannot build loyalty. It cannot build love. Adrian's father knew that. And that is why I am here." The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his tone firm. "According to the conditions, Mrs. Claire Hale stands by her husband today. The inheritance remains with Adrian Hale." Outrage erupted, but the tide had shifted. For the first time, Adrian's uncle stood powerless. Adrian pulled Claire closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I almost lost you. I will never doubt you again." She looked up at him, rain still glittering on her lashes. "Then do not, because I never lied to you. Not about why I stayed, and not about what you have become to me." The room faded around them, the storm outside beating against the windows. In the middle of power, betrayal, and greed, Adrian finally understood what his father had meant. Wealth could be inherited, but love had to be chosen. And in that moment, he chose her. The storm outside eased into a gentle rain by the time the crowd dispersed from the mansion. Adrian and Claire stood together in the now quiet hall, the echo of arguments and accusations fading into silence. The weight of the inheritance, the company, and the family name still pressed on Adrian's shoulders, but for the first time, he did not feel alone in bearing it. Later that evening, he found Claire in the library, seated near the fireplace. She held the thin wedding band in her hand, the same ring she had once left on the desk when she prepared to walk away. She turned it over slowly, her gaze distant. Adrian crossed the room and stopped in front of her. "That ring was meant to be part of a contract," he said. "But it has become something else entirely." Claire looked up, meeting his eyes. "It was never real, not at first." "Shrual." He knelt in front of her, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "Then let me make it real. Not for my father, not for the company, not for anyone else. Only for us." From his pocket he produced a small velvet box. Inside was a new ring, simple but crafted with care, shining in the firelight. The gesture was not about wealth, not about power. It was about choice. Claire's breath caught as he slid the false band from her fingers and replaced it with the real one. For the first time since she had entered his world, she felt she belonged not as a guest, not as a prop, but as a partner. Days later, the Hale estate opened its doors for a gathering unlike any before. There was no grand orchestra, no endless rows of champagne glasses, no jewels meant to outshine the stars. Instead, close friends, loyal staff, and a handful of family members who had stood by them filled the hall. Adrian and Claire exchanged vows, not in a performance, but in truth. When they sealed their promise with a kiss, the applause that followed was warm, genuine, untainted by greed. Even the stern portrait of Richard Hale seemed less forbidding in the glow of candlelight, as though the man himself had finally granted his blessing. Outside, the rain cleared, revealing a night sky scattered with stars. Claire leaned into Adrian's side as they stepped onto the balcony, the city lights shimmering below. "You once told me I would disappear from your life after 3 days," she whispered. Adrian drew her closer. "I was wrong. You are not leaving. You are home." For Claire, who had lived so long without one, the word home carried more weight than any fortune. And for Adrian, who had inherited an empire but never known peace, it was the only truth that mattered. Together, they stood beneath the starlight, not as heirs, not as actors in a contract, but as two souls who had found their place in each other. The empire would go on, but love would guide it. And that love, born from a lie, had become the only real thing they could never lose.